It began with a message on an obscure online forum, looking for someone who wants to be eaten. Most readers scrolled past, assuming it was performance art or dark humor. But one man answered. Their chat logs, later released in court, revealed a strange pact between two strangers who mistook isolation for connection. What started as fantasy became a plan. When police finally entered a quiet house in Rothenburg, they found proof that the internet had given loneliness a stage and the world a question it still can't answer. How do you prosecute consent when it ends in death? Tonight, we reopen Germany's most unsettling digital case and trace how a single post exposed the darkest corners of online desire. In December 2002, German police received an unusual tip from a man who had seen something disturbing on a web forum devoted to extreme fantasies. He claimed that one of the users had posted real evidence of a crime committed in the small town of Rothenburg an der Fulda. When investigators traced the username, it led them to Armin Maves, a 41-year-old computer technician living alone in a half-timbered house on the edge of town. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, always punctual. His online history told a different story. Years of messages seeking a willing participant. Detectives obtained a warrant and searched the home. In the attic, they discovered video equipment, detailed chat logs, and a computer containing archived conversations. What they read confirmed that what had once sounded like an internet fantasy had crossed into reality. Maywis was arrested that night without resistance. In custody, he spoke calmly, even courteously, explaining that everything had been agreed upon by both men. He said he felt relieved that it was finally over. The case stunned Germany. Reporters descended on Rothenburg, and prosecutors debated how to classify an act that defied every legal category. Was it murder, assisted suicide, or something entirely new born of the Internet age? By the end of the week, tabloids called him the German Cannibal, but investigators called it something else. The first homicide of the digital century, a crime planned not in secrecy, but in open text, line by line on a public screen. Before his arrest, Armin Maves lived two parallel lives. By day, he maintained computers for a local firm. By night, he disappeared into message boards that existed before social media hidden forums where users discussed isolation, fantasy, and control. The site that brought him attention was called Cannibal Cafe, a small corner of the early internet run on primitive bulletin board code. Users posted long manifestos about identity, loneliness, and taboo desire, most treated as performance art shock literature for anonymous audiences. But inside those threads, Maywis found people who wrote back. He spent hours composing detailed messages, describing not violence but the idea of possession and belonging. Forensic analysts later compared his writing style to that of people suffering chronic isolation. Psychologists noted the absence of aggression. His posts read like applications for companionship, not predation. That paradox would later dominate his trial, a crime born not of rage, but of disconnection. Investigators mapped more than 400 conversations stored on his hard drive. Many users backed out after learning he was serious. One, however, continued, and their dialogue would eventually define the case. When police examined the server logs, they saw a pattern emerging across the globe. Small, anonymous subcultures using early internet anonymity to explore forbidden thoughts without censorship or empathy. Experts testified that technology had not created the darkness. It had simply given it a room with no doors. In Germany, lawmakers began drafting new cybercrime provisions almost immediately. The Maywes case proved that the web could host not only information but intent. It was the moment the digital age learned that words typed in fantasy could become evidence in reality. The courtroom and castle looked ordinary wood panels. Fluorescent lights, but what unfolded there forced Germany to redefine murder itself. Armin Maywes admitted everything. He insisted that it had been consensual, describing the encounter as the fulfillment of a mutual agreement. No one in the room had ever heard a defendant argue that consent could erase the crime of taking a life. The first trial in 2004 became a global spectacle. Journalists filled every seat. Legal scholars followed each session like a philosophy seminar. The defense argued that Maywes had not acted out of hatred or greed, the usual motives recognized by German law. Prosecutors replied that society cannot authorize its own destruction. In the end, the court delivered a compromise, manslaughter and an 8.5-year sentence. Public outrage followed immediately. Editorials called the verdict too merciful for a moral vacuum. Germany's Federal Court of Justice ordered a retrial. 2 years later, the second panel ruled that consent could not excuse the act. It was murder because human life is not a contract to negotiate. Maywes received a life sentence. He accepted it quietly. The debates did not stop. Philosophers saw the case as a mirror for the digital age. When fantasy communities blur with reality, who draws the boundary? Bioethicists compared it to assisted suicide law. Psychologists saw proof of isolation breeding delusion inside online echo chambers. In time, the case entered textbooks not as a story of horror, but of jurisprudence. It asked a timeless question that technology had made urgent again. How do you legislate desire in a world where strangers can turn confession into content? After the verdict, the courtroom closed, but the story refused to die. News desks across Europe treated it like a cultural autopsy. Headlines shifted from reporting to retelling. Every network sought its own metaphor for what had happened in Rothenburg. In less than a year, the German Cannibal became a brand name for collective unease. Documentary crews arrived in the quiet village, filming the timber-framed streets where nothing outwardly remained of the case. Neighbors stopped giving interviews. Some shops removed their town's name from signage to avoid tourism of the morbid kind. Producers optioned film rights. Talk shows debated whether depicting the story risked glorifying it. Ethicists called it the media's mirror test. Could journalists examine darkness without amplifying it? By 2005, Internet culture had adopted the case as shorthand for the extremes of online anonymity. Forum users quoted Mays, not to sensationalize him, but as a symbol of what unchecked isolation could create. In digital subcultures, he became less a person and more an algorithmic ghost proof that every taboo finds an audience when bandwidth is infinite. German broadcasters eventually restricted late-night rebroadcasts, fearing fascination might eclipse caution. Meanwhile, true crime scholars began using the case as a timeline marker. Before Rothenburg, online depravity was rumor. After Rothenburg, it was legal evidence. The man at the center of it all gave few interviews. In one, he said he hoped others would learn from loneliness. That line became the closing caption of several documentaries, transformed again by repetition into something mythic. By the late 2010s, the story had completed its evolution. From crime report to cautionary folklore, preserved not in headlines but in hashtags, it was the digital era's own grim tale, told in code instead of ink. When experts studied Armin Meiwes after his conviction, they didn't focus on violence, they focused on absence. He'd grown up isolated in a rural home, surrounded by silence after his father left. Psychiatrists noted how his adulthood reflected the same pattern. Years spent in front of a screen, trying to script a perfect bond that real life never delivered. In interviews, Meiwes described his online world as a place where no one judged, only answered. To investigators, that was the key. The case wasn't just about obsession. It was about control in a digital age where communication could replace companionship. Forensic psychologists later used the Rotenberg trial to illustrate a broader trend. The illusion of intimacy produced by constant connectivity. Chat rooms, they said, let people build entire emotional structures from words alone, without the friction that reality demands. When empathy disappears from the equation, imagination can spiral unchecked. Across Europe, mental health researchers cited the case as an example of pathological loneliness, a state where fantasy becomes self-reinforcing because it's the only space where someone feels understood. They compared it to the phenomenon of online radicalization. Both feed on echo chambers. Both promise belonging through extremity by the mid-2010s. Germany had launched new programs addressing digital isolation. Counselors used the Rotenberg case in training modules about early warning signs, how fantasy and community can mix into dangerous chemistry when empathy collapses. For most people, the story's horror wasn't in the act itself, but in its ordinariness. A man with Wi-Fi, a keyboard, and too much quiet. It forced society to ask whether technology had made us more connected or just better at hiding our solitude. More than 20 years later, the name Rotenberg still surfaces whenever the Internet's extremes are discussed. The house is gone, the garden rebuilt, yet journalists still drive by to film the road sign as if searching for a moral coordinate. For Germany, the case remains a reminder that technology doesn't invent darkness, it only archives it. Law students now study the verdict as precedent. Digital ethics classes debate where consent ends and responsibility begins. In court transcripts, Meiwes appears calm, almost clinical. Psychiatrists say that detachment is what made the story unforgettable. Not rage, but logic without empathy. Since then, police units have learned to read online conversations as potential evidence. Entire departments of cyber behavioral experts trace how language can reveal intent long before action. What began as an isolated case reshaped global policy on Internet policing. Meanwhile, true crime culture transformed the story again. Documentaries reframed it as a cautionary tale about loneliness. Podcasts dissected the philosophy of consent. For most listeners, the fascination isn't in the act itself, but in its mirror. The awareness that any screen can hide a world no law has yet defined. When asked years later whether he regretted what happened, Meiwes answered, "I wanted someone to stay with me forever." That line, tragic and ordinary at once, encapsulated the paradox that technology exposed. Infinite connection, zero closeness. Today, The Rotenberg case stands less as a headline than as a lesson in digital empathy. It reminds us that the distance between fantasy and reality is only a few keystrokes wide, and that every post, every message is a record of what we choose to believe about ourselves. If you thought the horror ended here, you're wrong. What other dark rituals and forbidden practices are still being performed in secret? Dive deeper into the chilling world of haunted ceremonies, banned footage, and eerie folklore that refuses to stay buried. Click on the playlist to uncover terrifying recordings, lost evidence, and disturbing stories they never wanted you to see. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for weekly uploads of spine-tingling footage and dark tales that echo from the shadows. This is the Forbidden's Archive, where the hidden truth and haunting evidence come to life.